welcome to Taking Liberties, episode 27 for season 5. My name is Lee. I am in WA. I am joined by my good, faithful friend, Zeev, in Melbourne.
Greetings.
Now, we are doing a voice-only thing because, sadly, Zeev's camera, his webcam has passed on to the great electronic beyond. Press F to pay respect.
Yes.
But this week, we won't be stopped. We've got two excellent topics to talk about. We're going to be talking about drought, which is currently going on the East Coast. But particularly, we're still going to focus on like drought assistance and that kind of thing. And we're going to talk about Fraser Anning and the final solution to immigration, because that's not, a contentious thing to talk about when you give a speech to Parliament, to use the phrase final solution. Let's begin with the drought. We're going to talk about Fraser Anning first. Yes, let's talk about Fraser Anning first. So Fraser Anning is the brand new senator for the Katter's Australia Party, Bob Katter's Australia Party. And he gave a speech this week where he described, basically he went to town talking about the evils of Islam, praising the White Australia policy, and talking about a final solution to immigration, which of course, people didn't respond too well to hear him use that phrase. More or less, this is kind of Pauline Hanson 3.0, I guess, since we've actually had Pauline Hanson 2.0. But this is a speech very reminiscent of Pauline Hanson's maiden speech back in 1996, where she talked about being swamped with Asians. What were your thoughts upon hearing about what he discussed?
Well, I think the speech, I'm having a brief read of it at the moment as we speak as well. It's really filled with this kind of nostalgia for times gone by. And on top of that, there's this sense of a fear of profound social change, which is what Fraser is seemingly the most concerned about. And, this kind of idea of, quote, both Liberal and Labor parties in the 1960s reflected a common framework of Judeo-Christian values and recognised the importance of I'm skipping ahead, our predominantly European identity. So it's very much this kind of idea of, Australia as this white picket fences and very white coloured, I should say, place where everyone has their little home and everyone has their orderly lifestyle prescribed and sponsored by the government of the day. You will get married, you will have children, you will be white, you will send your kids to school. All of these things are not just, one way of living and doing things. It's just like this must be the only way of doing things for everyone. I think there's this vision there that, heaven forbid that someone from overseas should try to do that, particularly if they're not white. So I guess that's the kind of conservative vision of, civilization under assault, that Fraser Anning is really harking back to, this idea that once upon a time things were great and now suddenly we've let in all these people with different colours to us and, speaking different languages, and somehow, that means that we're doing badly, which doesn't really gel with the fact that we're among the most prosperous nations in the world, to me at least. I mean, it doesn't quite gel with that for a starting point. And I think the other point that doesn't quite gel with me is that, I mean, this is a libertarian podcast, so there can't really be that much surprise that I don't really agree that, people should be looked at as having, different value or being degraded just because they're not white and European. And I should say this, it's very convenient of Fraser Anning to pick white European now, because no one hates Greeks and Italians quite as much as they do anymore. Back in the 50s and 60s, back then they were the new migrants, and that's when everyone hated them. But now look how inclusive he's being by not hating on the Greeks and Italians, and he's very careful to say how he supports Israel too. So, he doesn't quite hate the Jews as much, maybe, or something. I'm not quite sure what his messaging is there, but that's...
I don't think it's supporting Israel necessarily.
No, I'm not...
I'm opposed to hating Jews.
I know, but that's the signalling.
The Jews have a place in the world, and it's in Israel and not where we are.
Yeah. All I'm saying is that's the signal... Yeah, that you may be quite right on that, Lee, but that's... He explicitly cited that himself when he was the journos questioned him, and it's like, but look at my support for Israel, blah blah blah. In media interviews, that's what he said. So look, I think broadly we have a speech by a man who really is very insular in his point of view. He seems to think that, the whole country is just, just inundated and therefore threatened by immigrants. He has no real understanding of the economic benefits they bring, and he condemns them outright, which is just, amazing. And on top of that, I just find it the most interesting thing is the way he talks about the problem of immigration, which is the problem with immigrants, the problem with people. That's what he's saying, that people, people's next door neighbours, people's friends, family, and all of that shouldn't be allowed to bring their family here from overseas. In a nutshell. That's what he's saying. He's saying it's a problem of, quote, immigration policy, or, the immigration problem. It's a nice little abstraction, but he really just has a problem with immigrants, with people. And that kind of, the weasel words of immigration, lets him avoid that, I think, to some extent. Although... I think it's clear also that he has a lot of hatred for Muslims. If you look at this speech, he's very, very critical of Muslims, and I struggle to see exactly where his source is for this extraordinary criticism, which is just totally, it's lumping together people of totally different backgrounds, cultures, and belief systems who couldn't be any more different if you tried. It's just like, well, he's condemning, African Muslim gangs, quote unquote, as if to say that terrorizing Melbourne, or as if these Sudanese Australian boys, by the way, some of them are probably Christian, are in any sense motivated by religion when they engage in carjackings or the like. It's ridiculous. If you've met any of them, and I don't pretend to know them deeply and well, you'll see that they dress up in this kind of mock African American gangster style culture, with the Nikes and the baggy shorts and t-shirts, and apparently that's Muslim now. I don't know about that, Fraser Anning. I think it's just this general sweeping, they're different, they're from somewhere else, and they've turned a few of these people, not the whole community. have turned to crime, and suddenly, I mean, so why would anyone want to bring more of them here? Well, I mean, to state the obvious, because um, whatever happened to trial by jury? Collective punishment, is that how we treat people here now? Someone commits a murder or a robbery, do we hang the family too? I mean, it's crazy, this idea that immigration policy should be based this way. But sorry, I'm going on a long little.
Yeah, that's all right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like somebody really needs to put this side by side with Pauline Hanson's maiden speech, because I mean that's like that in some ways is the quintessential flaw with this anti-immigrant nationalism, which, by the way, he explicitly calls himself a nationalist in this speech, which I find interesting. I mean, if you go back to Pauline Hanson, 1996, being swamped by Asians, and I would imagine her arguments are exactly the same.
No doubt.
If you were to compare the rhetoric between this and her speech, you would find it'd be pretty much identical. And yet, in the 20 years that's happened, all of a sudden, Asians now aren't a problem anymore. And if you go back to, like, he talks about Whitlam, who he himself had a problem with Vietnamese migration. He famously being quoted in the cabinet papers of talking about how he doesn't want Vietnamese bolts coming over to Australia. So the thing that always gets me with these nationalists is that, well, okay, sure, you say there's this problem socially with this group of people. Well, explain to me why these people are different from the dangerous immigrants that have came before them. Like if we go back long enough, and which you've alluded to, go back to the 50s. I mean, he talks about, I remember Queensland when it was in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, when working blokes could get good, well-paying jobs, actually making products for us to buy, blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
Well, they just had, they had funny names back then, and they were from Southern Europe, and they're from Eastern Europe, and those were the dangerous people. And then prior to that, well, and of course, Jews have always been the issue. And then it was the Irish and the Catholics if you go back even longer. So
absolutely.
And then Chinese, the Chinese have had two runs of this. They had the paranoia, or the nationalism back in the late 1800s during the gold rush, and they've had another crack at it back in the 90s. Yeah. So it's really just, I mean, these people are broken records. They just repeat the same thing. You just hear different snippets of the song. It's just always the same logic, though. And I mean, I think in some ways this speech sums up the contradiction that lies at the heart of the nationalist framework of thinking, because he talks about, I believe as the American revolutions did, that government is usually the problem and not the solution, and that in order for people to be free, the power of government must be constrained. Well, that's great. Like, we would agree with that. He says there's a couple of places where he says stuff that I think libertarians would wholeheartedly agree with. And yet he talks about the golden age of Joh Bjelke-Petersen, who ran a police state in Queensland during the 70s and the 80s, and the 60s, I think, as well. He talks about, this is a great one. He talks about when through statutory and orderly marketing, i.e. quotas and price controls,
and
farmers were not bled white and cartels. Farmers were not bled white by rapacious corporations or forced to sell to Chinese carpetbaggers. So he's got there's this thing. He sort of longs for this period of time before. Well, I think it's interesting. He says the early 80s, because really it's the mid 80s when the economic transformation that comes under Hawke and Keating and continues through Howard and Costello. That's when it starts to happen. So really, this in some ways, despite all this talk of the desire for freedom, governments being there to defend contracts. I believe the key role of government is to provide laws for the enforcement of contracts, to provide physical security for businesses and individuals. Well, then he says, and to build infrastructure. So on the one hand, he's got this belief in we all need to go out there and work hard and do our thing, and yet at the same time, he wants government support for farms. It's handouts.
And a rural development and reconstruction bank. And and going after the banks, and it's a mess. And it's really, I mean, this is a speech really from
from the from the 60s. Like, this is really like, if you look at how the world existed back during Menzies, when there were massive price controls. I mean, Whitlam criticized, and this speech criticizes Whitlam for being cultural Marxist and blah blah blah. But Whitlam did something amazing, which is he smashed tariffs. I mean, that's, if you read the
speech,
biography
he condemns that. I should say he is a protectionist, Fraser Anning.
Yes,
a massive protectionist, and part of his speech is quite explicitly condemning the fact that the fact of free trade. Here he is.
Yes.
He's talking about a focus on economic nationalism of the Joe era nationals. He's talking about. I mean, it's clear, really, that he sees Australia as this kind of economic unit that, if we don't make enough widgets in one department, and heaven forbid if someone else makes the same widgets overseas, that means we've lost those widgets. We should be making all the widgets and all the cars and all the everything should be
all
here.
All the
steel.
Like, I mean, this is like, I mean, this is Trump. This is what Trump is promising. He is, and he's actually about the same age as Trump. So I'm not, this is really, we need to go back to building steel and cars, and there's no room in this world for this, that Anning and Trump and many Hanson. There's no room for innovation in their world. They are stuck. I mean, I feel like I'm starting to talk like Nick Gillespie, who on the Reason podcast is always talking about like the last gasp of the boomers, like the last gasp of the last century, where you've got these old codgers who are in politics who just keep like longing for the 50s, longing for a world that doesn't exist and hasn't existed for about 60 years. And it's well, thank God the guy's in his nearly 70, because this generation. Maybe this logic will die with this. I mean, it probably won't die with this generation, but it's really, this is the last gasp of the 60s.
I hope.
And,
look, certainly I don't think many young people support Fraser Anning, but the thing is that young people get older, and who knows? Yeah. Cultural tendencies may change. And with
it's true. I mean, it's.
Look at the extraordinary support for New Zealand now banning foreign investment in at all in its real property sector. I mean, the idea that foreigners shouldn't be allowed to buy land is amazing to me. That on the one hand, it's an extraordinarily popular idea because housing is so expensive. But on the other hand, people would often say in the same breath that they value diversity and multiculturalism, and
yes,
people just, they just haven't thought it through, that there's this obvious contradiction between foreigners not being able to buy land, in Australia, and on the other hand, we value diversity and multiculturalism. Well, how are they meant to get here? Where are they meant to live if they can't buy land here? It's a curious question.
And alternatively, I mean, Fraser Anning says, "I believe in the unfettered ownership of private property."
Yeah,
well,
unless you're a foreigner.
If you really believe that, exactly. If you really believe that, then Australians could hire foreigners to work in their jobs. Exactly. But apparently, that's that's stealing jobs from Australians.
Yeah. No, I mean it's extraordinary. I mean, whatever happened to a landlord or a seller wanting to buy to someone who's willing to lease or buy the land, and they're foreign? Well, suddenly they're not allowed. But anyway, an employer wants to hire a foreign person. I mean, you would think that would be a pro-business policy, surely, or something. But anyway. But here we are. Well, this is no different to Tony Abbott's nonsense about, what is it? If we bring in migrants, then wages go down. I mean, it's ignorant bullshit, but
yes,
they can get away with it.
Tony Abbott spouting ignorant bullshit? Surely not. the former
Outrage.
Prime Minister of Australia.
Mm.
I have to say, often, someone who's often criticised from the right in particular, Catherine Devaney, who, is a controversial, hardcore lefty. She said something brilliant about this whole thing. Oh, yeah, we're going to talk about it in a sec. No, so I'm getting my topics confused. Because we're going to talk about the drought.
Yeah.
Which I guess this ties in because he's, we've talked about...
He's talked about how farmers need to be protected, Fraser Anning, which is topical because farmers are currently experiencing a drought in some parts of Australia. And that ties into what we're going to talk about, which is drought assistance.
Yes. So Turnbull's announced $200 million of drought assistance, i.e. bailouts for the farmers in New South Wales and Queensland. And Catherine Devaney sparked controversy where she used the phrase correctly: socialise the losses, privatise the profits. The government bankrolling farmers shit me. She goes on to say how, that she wants quality food that's farmed ethically and safely. Yes, I want people paid properly. This can all happen without bankrolling bad businesses. And yes, in Australia, some farmers are thriving because they're responding to the change in the markets and climate. Others have a breathtaking sense of privilege. It's impossible for me to fathom. Why are farmers, along with a few other industries, bailed out time after time again? Well, Catherine, that is the absolute right question, which is something we at this show always try to ask. And really it comes down to preferential treatment. Our good friend, Public Choice, explains it.
It's where the votes are in the country.
That's it.
Most voters are in the city and probably might be a little offended, like Catherine is, that we bail out farmers again and again and again. Although, a lot of city voters might feel sorry for them, but you're more likely to experience that kind of cynicism about it if you're a city dweller, like I am, I suppose. But I mean, the fundamental point is that farming is a business like any other, and in that business, people take commercial risks, and it wouldn't be right to reward people for taking risks and not succeeding in their enterprises. I mean, if I opened up a law firm tomorrow and it failed, it would be a curious thing if the federal government turned around and said, gee, sorry, Zeev, here's a law firm failure assistance package for a couple of $1 million to tide you over in these hard times. If the local bakery went under, small family bakery or something, or a little shop somewhere, the federal government's not going to turn around and hand it the few $1 million to tide it over. Farming is no different. And the only reason it's treated differently is because regional voters are in the regional electorates and they want handouts for the bad times, and they don't want to get drought insurance. Maybe drought insurance isn't viable, but that says something about the business model, that it's high risk.
Absolutely. And also, the Nationals, this is their voter base, and they have a huge... They play, a substantial part of the federal coalition. Like, without the Nationals, the Liberals would never have the numbers to get into government.
That's
very rarely, much more rarely. So, they've essentially, much like the unions have an in with Labor and will always have a voice.
Yeah.
Well, with the coalition, they'll have that similar voice because basically there is a political party that exists to pander to them.
Correct. Even though they're a minority of the country. I mean, very few people are farmers compared to the rest of the population, but they have relatively strong political sway because the Nationals have opened up to support them, and that's where their concentrated power is, and hence they will keep getting handouts that no other industry, no business in any other industry would ever dream of getting. The only businesses that get handouts when they fail are the politically popular ones. That's the reality of it, and that's the only reason they get them. There's no pretense of any kind of economic value to it, because at the end of the day, you know, in times of drought, we turn to food from overseas, as we always will and always have. And people will turn to local farmers here when it's viable to do so as well. So, anyway.
And I mean, ultimately, the people who are truly punished for this are other farmers. So if it wasn't for the bailouts, those farmers who either have better land, which is with a more reliable source of rainfall, like, I mean, I guess Victoria would be a good example of that. You know, they would be able to buy up that land, or they would benefit from higher prices. You know, so they would be rewarded for their prudence. I mean, that's ultimately the thing that's being subsidized here, as you've said, is a bad business model. It's not preparing for this. It's not like we have never had droughts before. It's not like Australia has, you know, been known for consistent heavy rainfall every year, year in, year out.
Correct.
It's always been dry. The land has always been tough to farm. And if farmers can't deal with that, then either they should rely on donations, which, I mean, to be fair, there's a large charitable many charitable sort of, you know, Coles and Woolies and everybody's doing fundraising. A lot of organisations are doing fundraising right now for farmers, which is fine and great if people want to contribute that way. But ultimately, by bailing out farmers who have bad business practices or live on marginal land that really maybe shouldn't be farmed, it's other farmers who are hurt. They're the ones who aren't given the competitive advantage that they should have. You know, they should be rewarded for their prudence or their choices, or for paying a higher price for better land, or whatever it is. You know, the market has a way of allocating these things that maybe not be perfect, but generally, you know, it's going to be fairer than government bailouts. You know, correct. So in addition to the taxpayers being hurt, it's other farmers. And
look, I mean, people may need help in these times because they're facing financial difficulty. And there's nothing wrong with helping people that face financial difficulty. But, I mean, the question is, are they facing financial difficulty and how much help should we give them? Right? And that question,
when you say we, as in, like, people voluntarily or people through
people voluntarily. Or even if it were by government, whatever, it doesn't matter, because what I'm getting at is that, in principle, those are the two questions that matter. It shouldn't matter whether you're a farmer or a bowler or an engineer or what have you. The question is, are you poor enough to deserve financial assistance, whether it be from a charity or if you think that, you know, the government should step in and have a safety net that way. And to hand out more to some because they're politically popular than to others, it really makes no sense. Anyway, but you see what I mean. You know, someone turns homeless. It shouldn't matter if that homeless person was a former farmer or a former lawyer or a former professor of economics or a former shopkeeper.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess, like, you know, the ideal thing would maybe, not that I'm a huge supporter of it, but like a universal basic income, like that would be preferable to, not that it's affordable, but, you know, that would be preferable to you know, politically motivated bailouts of certain industries.
Well, I mean, Centrelink is preferable, is what I'm getting at, or some measure of, or just voluntary assistance. I'm not. Yeah. You know. Anyway. That's my 2 cents there.
Sure. Yeah. I just because I posted about the Catherine Devaney thing on Twitter, well, on my Facebook page, which is Aussie Liberty, if anybody's interested, and it tweets for me automatically. And somebody replied, you know, saying how you shouldn't be giving bailouts, and the guy replies, "I don't know, man. Feels like we're providing food domestically might be important." Well, that still happens. Not all the farmers are out of business. And those farmers that still exist are getting higher prices. Therefore, being rewarded. And
the fact that there's a drought now, I mean, doesn't mean that, you know, the fact that these particular farmers are getting assistance now doesn't mean that there's going to be more food produced later on. It could just be that those farmers will pack up shop, leave, and in turn that land will be bought up and developed as farmland, maybe more prudently, maybe not, by some future developer once the land becomes, green and verdant again.
Yeah.
I mean,
the other thing is it might...
drought assistance doesn't create more food. That's what I'm saying.
No, it's true. And it doesn't... Like, often it's these hard times that encourage consolidations, and that would actually lead to lower prices for food in the long term because farmers can produce it more efficiently because they are larger. And in some ways, that's what we've seen in every industry. If you look at it, we've seen already in agriculture to a large degree because there used to be a lot more people who work in agriculture that don't because machines now do the job. And just like we saw in factories, building a factory, you don't have many small mass factories that produce, massive amounts of products. Like small factories will produce niche products where if, our socks are made in huge factories elsewhere, because essentially that as time, those businesses have consolidated into bigger and bigger enterprises. Well, farming assistance is going to stop that consolidation from happening. So in effect, not only are taxpayers screwed by this, not only are the farmers screwed by this because they can't consolidate, but consumers are screwed by this because we'll pay higher prices in the long run because you can't get those large efficiencies. So yeah, there's just so many angles to why this is a bad idea, not just for agriculture, for any industry. No industry should be getting bailouts. But as we've discussed, it's easier said than done. So political reasons. All right. Well, I think that basically covers it for this week. I think in future weeks we're going to be talking about the government's attempt to break cryptography once we can get Vickers back on the line because that's his jam. So look forward to that for next week. And thanks everybody for joining us. Make sure you like us on Facebook. You can subscribe to us on iTunes or on YouTube. And thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much.